My first guest is Michelle Goldberg, columnist at the New York Times, award-winning author, television commentator on MSNBC and elsewhere. She's going to be speaking for the motion, and it's terrific to have you in Toronto, Michelle.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So give us your kind of opening gambit here.
Okay. Right, so you know, and I'm going to say this on stage, right, that when you first presented me with this motion, I balked a little bit, right, because there are a lot of things that fall under the rubric of political correctness that I don't consider progress, you know, and I've been really critical in my columns of no platforming, of, you know, some of the sort of excesses of social justice culture on college campuses. But one thing that made it a little bit easier to, I think in support of this resolution was the people that I'm debating, right? Because certainly what Jordan Peterson calls correctness, or calls political correctness, I call progress, right? I mean, kind of, he describes almost any efforts to rectify or acknowledge discrimination against women or sexual or gender minorities as, you know, kind of a politically correct assault on the natural order. You know, Stephen Fry, I think less so, and there's probably more overlap between Stephen Fry and my thinking, although, you know, I would disagree, for example, with his fierce opposition to tearing down statues of figures that we now revile, just because I think that, you know, cultures change and people should be allowed to decide who they honor and celebrate and commemorate.
You're going to hear an argument tonight, probably from both Fry and Peterson, about this idea that at the core of the Enlightenment, at the core of the Western project, is this belief in the assertion of the individual and the individual's ability to define themselves, to speak their minds, and to do this irregardless of the harm, maybe even in the case of some of our debaters today, even in the case of promulgating hate. Where do you come down on that debate? Well,
so, you know, one of the things that's going to be, I think, a little bit, we'll see how it plays out, is that we have people coming from 3 different countries, right? With probably with three very different understandings of free speech and hate speech laws, right? So I kind of have, I think, a American liberal free speech conception, and so there are hate speech laws here in Canada or in the UK that would never fly in America, right? And that are very foreign to me. You know, I'm not a big supporter of hate speech laws. I'm somewhat of a civil libertarian on free speech. I would say that I think that this dichotomy between the assertion of the individual and the rights of the group is kind of a false dichotomy, right? Because when you have discrimination against groups, it impedes the ability of the individual to fully express themselves and realize their potential, right? So there were no rights for individual women or individual people of color without the movements on behalf of groups to allow individuals in those groups to realize, you know, to realize themselves. And so again, I guess I would reject the idea that there's a contradiction between movements on behalf of civil rights for groups of people and individual freedom. And I would also say that I actually think that our side is the side of the Enlightenment, right? I mean, the side of saying
human dignity, the promulgation of diversity.
The idea of being able to change culture, the idea that, you know, that of not being sort of beholden to traditional structures, of expanding, of the ever-expanding kind of circle of human freedom. I mean, that's an Enlightenment idea. You know, the idea that the kind of social order is extremely fragile and must be protected at all costs, or at almost all costs, which is an idea that sort of courses through Mr. Peterson's work, is to me the idea that's much more at odds with the Enlightenment.
You've written a lot on identity politics. What's your view of the criticism of identity politics that by putting race and issues of gender, class at the very center of our discourse, that we are denuding ourselves of the capacity to find common ground, to develop a shared consensus, to pursue common goals? This is all very tribal, very, in the views of Jordan Peterson and maybe Stephen Fry, very destructive.
Well, it's interesting that you put it like that, because the way it usually plays out in the United States is that centering issues of gender and race and maybe sexual identity stands in contrast to a class-based politics, right? I mean, there is no politics that doesn't have opposing groups or that doesn't have opposing interests, right? I mean, that's what politics is the contention of opposing groups. And it's kind of the question of which groups, and the criticism in the United States has been that identity politics, you know, race and gender often come at the expense of class and have ended up sort of undermining the New Deal coalition. But at least as far as the United States goes, the problem is that the New Deal coalition foundered on the shoals of race. I mean, that it fell apart in response to the civil rights movement. And so you kind of can't go around that. The only way, you have to go through it. You have to kind of deal with it head on unless you're willing to kind of constantly say that the rights of women and racial minorities are going to be subordinate.
Another argument, no doubt, that you'll hear tonight from your opponents is about men and women and about the conversation that we're having around the Me Too movement. I would expect on the stage tonight we're going to hear a case that we're in a cultural panic about the power of men and the supposed, in their view, subjection of women. What's your view on that? How do you think that's going to play out?
You know, it's interesting that the Me Too movement, I mean, it just started in, September? And, you know, within 3 months, not even, you know, I mean, it was just a few weeks old when suddenly everybody said, oh my God, have we gone too far? And when you actually look at who has been taken down in the Me Too movement, right? The idea that it's become this all-encompassing Stalinist inquisition. I mean, to go to prison, Bill Cosby had to have 2 trials, and how many women, you know, kind of telling similar stories of the most brutal sorts of rapes. You know, Harvey Weinstein, although Harvey Weinstein's, you know, he lost his career after being accused credibly and repeatedly with hard evidence of payouts by many, many women. Right, the people, I think, again and again, who have lost their positions and lost their jobs, right? Not lost their lives, not lost their freedoms, lost their jobs. You know, it hasn't been kind of because of a McCarthyist rumor. It's been because there has been multiple independently corroborated stories with hard evidence. And yet, I think it's so unusual that any men at all are kind of losing their jobs, right? Or that anybody is suffering consequences. It really is something new. And I think that's where the cultural panic is. You know, there's this cultural panic about, you know, the kind of end of male impunity. Do you think men need to kind of think about the historical privileges that have been conferred to them and maybe, if not step aside, at least make some more space for women, for other groups who have been historically disadvantaged? You know, I actually think that the things that we're asking of men maybe start a little smaller than that, right? Like, never take out your penis at work. You know, I mean, like, honestly, I feel like women are not asking, you know, yeah, maybe think about if you have a panel and it's all men, and particularly if you're discussing women's issues, maybe don't do that, you know? I think that again, I feel like there's such a huge gap between what is being asked of men and what some men perceive to be being asked of them. And that's, you know, that is part of the debate tonight, right? So, you know, I mean, I think that the men that I know, the men that I work with, they are sort of conscious of trying to promote more women, to, you know, for example, make sure that women and men are paid equally when they're at the same, you know, when they're doing equal work, when they're at the same stature in a company. You know, but I don't think that we're not asking for men to go through kind of Stalinist re-education camps, you know. Final question, Michelle. Do you think this debate boils down in some ways to a conversation about civility? I mean, if you wanted to look at, again, the so-called political correctness, people using that word pejoratively, is a lot of what, in a sense, they're criticizing is attitudes, inclinations on behalf of groups and individuals and institutions to try to behave towards one another
with a greater sense of civility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of what they're asking for is, maybe better manners, right? I mean, it's interesting to look back on the last panic about political correctness in the late 80s and early 90s and look about what...
I was in university then.
Right, and but if you look back at what it was that people really found unbearable about political correctness then, right, is that suddenly you were supposed to you couldn't refer to indigenous people as Indians anymore, and you couldn't use retard as a pejorative, and you weren't supposed to refer to adult women that you worked with as girls, and that really stuck in people's throats, right? You couldn't make gay jokes. And we look back on, I think most of those things now have sort of seamlessly been integrated, and so that now presumably, you would just never think to use that kind of language, right? It doesn't really feel oppressive to you that you can't use that language. It just feels like that language seems unkind and sort of retrograde. And I think that something similar is happening here, in that some of these changes they initially feel unnatural to people. They kind of stick in their throats. The ones that work and have social utility will kind of seamlessly become integrated into the language, and the ones that don't will fall away, just as some of the kind of more outre demands of previous periods of political ferment have fallen away.
Michelle, thank you so much. Great to have you here in Toronto.
Thank you so much.
And look forward to your appearance on the Munk debate stage tonight.
Thanks a lot.